So many things are going on in the atmosphere. Chemical spraying, of course, the chemtrails. Dane Wigington, he owns a 1,600-acre wildlife preserve next to Lake Shasta in California and has investigated all levels of geoengineering. Dane, welcome. How are you?
Good, George. Thanks for giving me the chance to address this issue in depth. Thankfully, people are waking up to this issue, and it's getting more serious by the day.
When we hear the word geoengineering, what does that mean, Dane?
Yeah, most people have never even heard that term, and the term basically, George, means that to try to engineer the climate on a global scale, and indeed that is going on. All available data indicates that without reasonable doubt.
Do you think the pilots, those who are spraying, know what they're spraying? Yes
and no. In the case of military pilots, we certainly believe they would know what they're involved with more so than any commercial pilots. And many ask, are commercial carriers involved with this? But there's data online, for example, Project Cloverleaf, that indicate a program outline for non-profitable commercial routes to be kept in the air for use in these programs. And indeed, commercial carriers have been identified from the ground leaving a particulate trail. Again, this is not a condensation trail, but a particulate trail. And those carriers, certainly appear to be involved, but we don't believe any commercial pilots or personnel would have any idea what's going on with these planes. Based on the data we've found so far, these systems would be automated and probably not involving direct knowledge of commercial pilots.
Now, the residue that comes from the traditional contrails, which is, of course, the vapor discharge coming off of a jet, normal, can they hurt you at all?
In comparison with an intentional payload disbursement, George, a big difference, and this is a big argument with people. Is it a contrail? Is it a chemtrail? And again, chemtrail being the layman's term for geoengineering. But people should consider things, for example, if you're in a very cold day, you're walking down the street, your breath is condensing as you go, you don't look behind you and see a trail stretching out for the last mile and expanding and covering the horizon. And again, NOAA's original data for a naturally occurring, quote, condensation trail was 70 below and 70% humidity. They've since scrubbed that from the net, just like they do after a nuclear accident. They suddenly change the, quote, safe levels and up them by 10,000%. So, the science is completely flexible when it comes to governmental agencies, but these trails that we see that linger and cover the sky to such a degree, George, that now global dimming, another term people aren't familiar with probably, is estimated right now to be 20%. That means 20% of the sun's direct rays are no longer reaching the surface of the planet. There's a hell of a lot of metal up there, and we know that for a fact from our testing.
We're going to get into that, too. That's a frightening statistic. When I left Los Angeles last week, I'm in St. Louis this week, I had not come across as many people as I did ever that just were sick. They had these respiratory coughs. They were sneezing. They were convinced they weren't sick, but they didn't know what it was. They said, gosh, we've never had allergies before. I'm not sure this is an allergy season. Is it possible, Dane, that some of the spraying contributes to things like that, where so many people just are sneezy, wheezy, itchy eyes and everything else, and it has the symptoms of an allergy?
It must be connected. And there are things, George, here that are absolutely beyond debate. There's a mountain of metal raining down on us, period. In the last 10 years, we've seen rain test samples escalate from 7 parts per billion. This is in Shasta, Siskiyou counties in Northern California. 7 parts per billion, which is already very high given the location, up to 3,450 parts per billion. That's nearly a 50,000% increase in aluminum in the rain. I mean, it's absolutely staggering levels. So when you have this mountain of metal raining down on you, and they're nanoparticulates based on the patent's description of them, which are the most destructive. The smaller the particle, the more destructive to the respiratory system. Now let's connect another dot. According to statistics from 2005 to 2010, respiratory mortality in the continental U.S. went from 8th on the list of mortality to 3rd.
Huge
leap. And sinusitis going off the charts, ADD, Alzheimer's, autism. I mean, as we see the metals go up, that are directly related to these programs, based on all available data, we see all these ailments go right with it.
And obviously, it falls into the water supply system too, doesn't it?
It does, and it would be very helpful if these agencies and people in agencies would start to speak out. I personally was called into Northern California Environmental Waste for a closed-door meeting and shown test of the Sacramento River, the drinking water for Southern California, with massive spikes in aluminum. and I was asked not to release those tests, which I have not, but I'm speaking about the issue now. So this is the big elephant in the room. I've had meetings with fish and game biologists, California Fish and Game, that are beside themselves with this issue, but afraid to speak out because they have no First Amendment protection. We do have a few courageous U.S. Forest Service biologists, one in particular that's retired recently, done water testing for 3.5 decades, and he has noted an aquatic insect life decline in the last 10-plus years, which he attributes to this metal from these programs of 90%. It's a virtual crash in aquatic insect life in Shasta-Siskiyou County. So, we're seeing similar results across the planet. So, what goes up must come down, and there's no question it's coming down.
We wake up in the morning, the skies are clear. By the afternoon, the place looks like a tic-tac-toe pattern. Is that what we're talking about?
It is. And again, that's what got me onto this issue. I grew up in Southern California hacking on smog. All I could think about as a kid was getting the hell out of there. And when I finally made it to the Pacific Northwest, and in 2001, completing this home in the wilderness and then seeing these grid patterns above my home, again, my background being in solar, some days losing 60, 70, 80% of my solar PV uptake from whatever these aircraft were emitting, and it quickly came to the subject of geoengineering, started testing, and seeing that the elements named in the patents were exactly what was showing up on the ground. And this is called solar obscuration, George. That's the goal of geoengineering, to block the sun. And indeed, we have solid and indisputed scientific data stating, again, 20% of the sun's direct light is no longer reaching the surface of the planet. Some regions it's even higher. So virtually every single dot connects. And for those that choose to say this isn't happening, they're simply putting their head somewhere where the sun doesn't shine. After a decade of study, George, I didn't just choose this issue because it felt comfortable to me. This is the last battle I ever wanted to face. But after one examines this data to a certain degree, the conclusion is reached that short of thermonuclear catastrophe, there is no more immediate or more dire threat to all life on Earth than these programs. They're thwarting the web of life from the atmosphere to the ground, from microbes in the atmosphere, which they're just learning about, and their effect on climate, to soil microbes and everything in between. So at a certain point, when you realize you can't walk out the door and breathe without sucking in a lungful of heavy metal, you know that you have no choice but to try to stand and scream out.
If they're modifying the weather day, why are they doing it? And why aren't they telling us?
Well, I think they're not telling us for obvious reasons, like they don't tell us about 100 other things that we now know that have happened in the past with the military-industrial complex. Many layers to the onion as far as why they are doing this. From all available data, it looks like they started these programs as far back as the late 40s. It looked like, as always, such programs start for the desire for more control and power. And my conclusions are, as these programs evolved and were used strategically, more and more damage has begun to occur in the atmosphere. The atmosphere is horrifically damaged now, by the way, and this is not about Al Gore or carbon credits. It's about reality. So it appears, to fast forward to right now, they have triggered things that cannot be stopped. They have triggered climate feedback loops, and not to say that there hasn't been other damage to the planet. Certainly human beings have done plenty to harm the system overall. But that being said, the greatest single factor in climate disruption right now that is not being acknowledged by almost any scientific entity is geoengineering. And now that it appears they've damaged the climate so horrifically, and they are trying desperately to spray more and manipulate more to try to cover up the damage they've already done. And that's a pretty vicious circle.
With this weather modification, how do we know they're not trying to control the population? The ability to reproduce in men has dramatically decreased. How do we know this isn't affecting that?
Well, I think we do know that it is affecting those aspects. And as far as that being part of an agenda, one can only conclude, we've seen studies from the Navy and Air Force on the effect of these nanoparticulates from, I believe, the late 90s. Rosalind Peterson, excellent researcher. I know you know her, and she's dug up a lot of this data. But so we know that they knew the harmful effects. That's common knowledge at this point, and they continue to spray anyway. So at minimum, one can only conclude that this massive health implication for life on Earth is either an accepted consequence or perhaps worse yet, even a desired objective. But we know now also that it's not just these metals, aluminum, barium, strontium, that we've identified, but there's a toxic synergism between these metals and other metals that we're exposed to, like mercury in the vaccines, mercury that we inhale from the burning of hydrocarbon. And we were given studies that indicated if you combine aluminum with mercury under the right conditions, toxicity can increase up to 10,000%. So it's not just the lethalness of either metal independently. When they are combined, they become much more harmful.
And with geoengineering, is it primarily the spraying and the weather modification, or does it include other things that they're doing?
Well, on the weather modification, that involves many aspects as well. And we look back in the last few years, the NATO countries are certainly up to their eyeballs in this, and it appears we have competing powers now as well, Russia and China, and that includes with the ionosphere heaters, the HARP installations. We think there might be as many as 18 around the globe right now. So on the strategic implications, in recent years we've seen countries, for example, like Pakistan, when they seem to be showing resistance to U.S. objectives, suddenly 20% of their country is underwater. In Thailand, a similar circumstance. The Thai government was reluctant to allow the U.S. to put a, quote, weather observation base there, which they probably realized was a weather modification base. Okay. And suddenly Thailand's under record floods and underwater. And so these dots do seem to connect. You have the Haiti situation, where the U.S. immediately moved in there after catastrophe. And it's just interesting, the coincidences here, and it certainly seems they would be anything but. So a lot of these dots seem to connect, and these programs seem to be being used for many purposes today.
Are they war machines, Dane?
When you have documents, George, like owning the weather, you've probably heard of that document, a U.S. military document stating the strategic purposes of owning the weather, and you have people like Ahmadinejad going in front of the UN, I believe twice now, and speaking to the fact that he believes his country is being droughted out by these programs. They can only be described as weapons of war. But when those weapons are turned on a country's own population, in the case of the drought in the continental U.S., and the drought is becoming very protracted, we post in Geoengineering Watch satellite photo images of the eastern Pacific almost daily, the blanket spraying that's occurring over the eastern Pacific. The data is clear on this, George. When you blanket spray like that in the atmosphere, you basically thwart the hydrological cycle, the rain cycle. And so we see this drought expanding, and we see the direct result when it's like the farmer in 1850s blocking the stream so the downstream guy starves out and then his land is bought up. We see similar circumstances like this happening, and all the objectives we can only speculate on, but we know by seeing the satellite data that they are in fact completely disturbing the hydrological cycle with what they're doing.
This is scary stuff, Dane, isn't it?
It is to me. It's again, I feel there's no greater or more immediate threat, or I would not have put a decade of my life on hold for this issue.
Does it appear that all administrations are supporting geoengineering?
It does. It does. Now, we've seen big ramp-ups at certain points. 1998 was a very warm year, and we saw a huge ramp-up of geoengineering after that point. We saw another one in 2005, 2006, and then 2008, 2009. There's various points where there appeared to be additional ramp-ups, but we're getting reports now, even in recent weeks, from all over the globe that most places are seeing considerably intensified spraying. And we are also seeing weather events, for example, the parade of named snowstorms that the Weather Channel now is creating their theater from, and that's another subject, George, called artificial ice nucleation, i.e. artificially induced snowstorms. We can talk about that if you wish.
Artificially induced snowstorms. Now, what would the purpose be for that?
Well, this is something that there can be a number of reasons for as well. One can be to create the semblance of winter. Two, to increase the Earth's albedo, the Earth's reflectivity. As ice is lost around the globe, the Earth's albedo is diminished, the reflectivity, so more of the sun's thermal energy is absorbed. We know these programs shred ozone. And again, I don't want anybody to believe a word I'm saying. I hope people look up every single thing I mention in this broadcast.